The clerk's voice was small under the hum of the room, undue influence, and it landed like a polished coin on varnished wood. Light from the high windows threw a strip across the bench. The brass nameplate of the judge caught it and held it, stubborn and bright. Cameras popped, not outrageously, but with that steady, professional click that suggests the world is being orderly about watching you. I sat very still, palms flat on the heavy folder in my lap, and felt the folder's edges press into my skin as if it wanted to speak for me. Before I go on, if you stay with me through this, you'll see how quiet, patient truth can undo a polished lie. If you want more stories told like this, subscribe to the channel, tap the bell so you don't miss the next releases, and give the video a like. It genuinely helps us keep doing the kind of careful reporting and storytelling that this case needed. The first memory that came after that word, undue influence, wasn't of lawyers or headlines. It was of lavender on the back porch at Jean Abbott's cottage. Her hands smelled of that lavender and cedar polish she used on the little cedar chest where she kept recipes and photographs. She would hum while she sorted tea bags into precise rows. Her laugh had a way of opening rooms. She gave without measure and never asked for notice. When she put her hand on mine, she would say, "Keep the small things tidy, Callie. They give you strength for the hard ones." The hard ones arrived slow as moss. Jean's first clear day after a mislaid memory was still full of her. She could tell the names of the grandchildren, she could tend the geraniums, she could recite long-forgotten recipes. Then the days folded in on themselves. She repeated the same question half a dozen times over a single afternoon, retraced steps she had just taken, mistook my shadow for a stranger. I learned to answer with the same phrase each time, because ritual studied her. "It's me, Jean. It's Callie. I made you tea." I learned to let her repeat things until she reached the shoreline of her recollection and could anchor again. Those rituals, tea, lavender, the cedar chest, became a quiet curriculum, patience, attentiveness to detail, a discipline of small mercies. They were the soil where my stubbornness took root. They were also the reason I read the envelope with my name on it twice, then a third time, because it didn't feel like something meant for me. The envelope arrived a week after Jean's funeral. It was sealed, heavy paper, and tucked inside was a copy of the will and a note in my grandmother's hand, "For when you're ready." The attorney who delivered it, patient, competent, and plainly uncomfortable, had arranged the meeting at my apartment because he said a public office felt wrong for such things. In the kitchen light, she sipped the tea I made and began to map the first lines. We started with what we had: the will, Jean's bank statements, the foundation's articles of incorporation. Alicia's technique was relentless in modesty. She created long columns of dates on legal pads, wrote donors' names in tidy cursive, and then traced connections. Who attended which gala? Who gave to which campaign? Overlapping receipts noted in margins. She asked precise questions about when Jean last signed documents and what witnesses had been present. "We will need receipts, guest lists, check images," she said. "We will need to understand the rhythm of gifts and the rhythm of events. Patterns will do more work than any accusation." I grew used to the ritual of it, Alicia's folder being slid across the table, the smell of printer toner mixing with lavender still lingering on my clothes. Folders became our armor. Each one carried a piece of the truth, heavy and plain. I learned to see them that way, not mere paper, but bricks in a structure that would hold the weight of what happened. The first reveal of the campaign's reach came when we received a batch of donor records from a public charity database. There were names I recognized from gala programs, names that appeared both as donors to my grandmother's foundation and as major contributors to my mother's political committee. It wasn't illegal on its face for donors to give to both, but the pattern began to look like threads of a single fabric. Large donations one day, gala sponsorship the next, then a transfer to a foundation account labeled vaguely for community outreach. The donor logs had timestamps, and those timestamps lined up with events my mother had hosted. Events where Jean had been photographed in a place of honor while aides arranged the press. One afternoon, Alicia laid an annotated map of those timestamps across the kitchen table, like a city plan. "Look here," she said, tapping a date. "This donor gave $25,000 on March 3rd. 2 days later, the gala guests list includes this donor and lists Jean as honorary host. 2 weeks after that, a wire appears to the foundation for $20,000, labeled Program Seed. She drew lines between these points with a thin black pen until the paper looked like an entangled street map. We follow the money and the appearances, and we see who benefits from the appearances. We also followed the more private traces. I found emails between a foundation coordinator and a campaign staffer. Banal, professional, until the language slipped and became directive. The coordinator asked, "Should we send Jean's name in the program as host?" The staffer's reply, "Yes, photos will be helpful." Photos. The word had a rancid weight. Photographs were what the campaign weaponized. They could make a quiet kitchen scene appear like a calculated pose. The first subpoena we served was for the gala guest list. It felt almost awkward, like asking for a menu from a dinner. But the list arrived, printed on flimsy paper, and when Alicia set it against the donor list, the overlaps were stark. Not just names, but addresses, the way certain donors were repeatedly seated at the head table. We began to see a network, donors whose contributions coincided with specific programmatic disbursements that behaved more like gifts to parties connected to my mother than like independent grants. Patrick, my father, sat in the living room one evening while we sorted through these lists. He had always been a man given to small gestures, a hand on my shoulder, a newspaper folded just so. He looked at a spreadsheet, and his face took on the tired look of someone who had just noticed a long-ignored stain on a shirt he had always considered clean. He said, "Elaine she handled the social stuff." The sentence trailed because he didn't have language for the part of governance that involved ethics. There was complicity in his silence. There was also sorrow. He reached for a cup of tea, missed it, and then put his hand over mine. That was the most he could do in that living room, hold warm porcelain and let his silence speak. The smear campaign's second phase was quieter, surgical. A local magazine ran a profile of my mother that read like a eulogy for her political career and a warning to those who trusted her. The profile didn't name names, but it hinted at questionable overlaps and concerns from donors. Another outlet wrote a piece about the foundation's need for professional governance and included a photograph of me standing beside Jean in a hospital corridor. The caption suggested impropriety. The image itself, taken out of context, did the rest of the work. In public, my mother spoke of transparency and due process. In private, staffers began to press for statements that would distance her from any accusation of influence. Alicia's response was always to return to the files. She told me, "Silence gives them room to paint. Paper doesn't." We compiled an index. Bank records became lines on paper. Guest lists turned into nodes. She had a way of naming each exhibit so that weight accumulated in language. Exhibit 1, Foundation Articles. Exhibit 2, Jean Abbott's Last Will. Exhibit 7, Gala Guest List. Exhibit 12, Donor Wire Transfers. The more exhibits we had, the less room there was for spin. Then we found the photograph. It arrived as a scanned image in an email from an archivist who had been helpful beyond what I had expected. The archivist, an older woman who had cataloged civic events for years, wrote a short note, "Found something you might need." The image was grainy but telling. It was taken in the back room of a gala, before the lighting and the speeches. In the center, my mother leaned over a table, her hand reaching toward Jean's hand as if to guide it. On the table lay a small, plain document, a form that later would be used to authorize funds. Jean's hand rested on the paper, fingers trembling slightly. My mother's other hand hovered above the pen, not touching, the gesture of a stage director more than a caregiver. There was a staffer looking on, a photographer's flash caught in the glass behind them. The timestamp keyed it to the very day that matched a donor transfer. It wasn't the only photograph we had, but its composition made it dangerous for them. It presented a tableau of proximity and direction. My mother as orchestrator, Jean as the central prop. To the untrained eye, it could be read as tenderness. In the ledger lines Alicia and I had been tracing, tenderness was a convenient ally of impropriety. When I held that scanned image on my laptop, my fingers trembled in a way that had nothing to do with grief, and everything to do with the way the world can tilt when you see how someone you loved arranged a stage. I thought of the cedar chest, of lavender, of my grandmother's small commandments about tidiness. I thought of how those rituals had become a blueprint for care, and how easily that blueprint had been borrowed for spectacle. I printed the photograph. The paper felt like a brick between my fingers. Alicia placed it into a clear exhibit sleeve with the kind of precise carefulness that suggested she was aware of the photograph's power. "We don't need to yell about this," she said. "We need to let people look." She labeled it Exhibit 24 and slid it into the stack. The stack was no longer merely defensive. It had become an argument in physical form. When stacked together and bound by chain of custody affidavits, these bricks of paper would be difficult to dismiss as rumor. I thought of Jean's hand on mine, and how she had taught me that small things hold up larger truths. The photograph was small and crude, and yet it aligned with the ledger lines until the pattern was unmistakable. Evidence was not a thunderbolt. It was a lattice of small, honest facts that, when arranged, carried their own gravity. The day we filed the exhibits with the court, I felt the weight of the folder differently. It was a weight I did not reject. It was the responsibility of stewardship. As we walked into the courthouse, the varnished wood and brass nameplates seemed less like props in a performance and more like the infrastructure of an institution. There would be theater there, rhetoric and performance, but there would also be the hum of procedure, the measured turning of pages, the small acts that make formal accountability possible. Judge Ruth O'Connor's bench rose like an island in the room. She was composed, hair pulled back, face practiced in the neutrality of a jurist. Her nameplate gleamed. Opposing counsel, Brian Keller, sat with the theatrical ease of someone who believes his own lines. My mother sat in a neat navy dress, the posture of public confidence in every muscle. The cameras arranged themselves like orderly crows. When the clerk said the case would proceed, something in the room tilted toward that same inevitability that the files had been building toward. We had the photograph, we had timelines and donor wires, We had Jean's instructions and her note that had been left for me with care. We had the small disciplines my grandmother had taught me. And I had decided very quietly and with a patience that was not the same as gentleness that I would see this through. Outside the courthouse steps, a staffer from my mother's office passed by and offered a smile that did not reach his eyes. A piece of paper rustled in his hand. It was a press release. I held my folder closer. The smell of lavender, real and imagined, seemed to cling to me like a talisman. We were about to set the stack of bricks down on the bench and let gravity do its work. The photograph sat at the top, plain as a small refusal. At council table, Alicia slid the exhibit binder toward me. Her hand tapped mine, a small sign, and when the bailiff called us to the lectern, I stood with the weight of the folder against my ribs, as if it were the sum of a life of small, repetitive care. The room quieted to a level where paper could be heard. I thought, absurdly, of my grandmother's tea being allowed to reach exactly the right temperature before she sipped it. The patience of that habit felt like training for this moment. I had not come to the courthouse to be dramatic. I had come because the will had named me as steward, and because stewardship sometimes requires you to stand and be steady while a polished image tries to pass itself off as fidelity. I had come to protect a legacy not for the sake of inheritance, but to honor the small, concrete kindnesses that had defined my grandmother's life. When Alicia gave me the nod, I felt the room's pressure shift minutely. The photograph was inside the binder, but I knew its moment was near. The files had been arranged not to accuse, but to align. Each document was a brick in a structure that, when the light hit it correctly, would not allow the varnish to hide cracks any longer. The judge looked down at the pile with a neutral face, and in that neutrality there was the possibility of an involuntary human reaction that could change the balance. We were ready to show them what a life of small, tidy facts could do. I placed the binder on the lectern and opened it to Exhibit 24, as if I were unfolding a small, stubborn map. The photograph lay there between my fingers, its corners softened by years. I did not lift my voice. I did not gesture for effect. I simply said, "Your Honor, Exhibit 24." Alicia slid a copy to the clerk. The clerk looked at the judge, who nodded once, the motion to admit the exhibit entering the room like a quiet agreement. Brian Keller rose, nominally courteous, and asked whether chain of custody had been established. His question was a practiced thing, the sort of motion that could, if accepted, reduce a thing to rumor again. "It has," Alicia said. She did not sound triumphant. She presented the stack of affidavits, one by one, each signed and sworn. Jean's neighbor, the woman who had driven her to the lab, the technician who had examined the negative years ago and noted its markings, the notary who had affirmed the envelope seal when Jean first gave it to me. Each small declaration slid across the table like a plank placed over an eddy. Brian read them with the same casual intensity with which he had read press headlines all week. He asked for time to review. The judge gave it. He had to, by custom and by the slow machinery of law. Minutes passed in the sort of silences that register against your ribs. I felt the paper beneath my palm like something that could either be a sail or a shield. When he rose again, his questions were narrower. "Miss Ellison," he said to me, "how did you come into possession of this photograph?" I answered succinctly, the way my grandmother taught me to. Tell the truth plainly, and let the truth sit in the room. I described the envelope, Jean's handwriting across the flap, the small note she'd tucked into the ledger. "For you, for when you are ready." I said the dates, the path the document had taken from Jean's kitchen drawer to my hands, the notarized affidavit that tied the present to a past action. Each small fact landed, quiet and tall. He tried another angle. And did you ever, he paused as if looking for the right verb, alter this image? No, I said. I kept the original in a folder that was sealed and signed by a notary the day it was photographed for transfer. I made no edits. He leaned forward, searching my face as if the answer might be elsewhere. So you are asking this court to accept a single photograph taken years ago as evidence that contradicts sworn testimony about the distribution of funds? It was a fair formulation. He wanted to make our structure look like a house of cards propped up by one postcard, but it was not a solitary thing. I tilted the photograph so the judge could see it. I did not dramatize the composition. In the image, my grandmother sat at a small folding table at a church supper. Her hands were mid-motion, offering a folded envelope to a young man whose face was turned away from the camera. On the table, partly obscured by a paper plate, lay a check stub with a very particular handwriting that matched the canceled check copies in the ledger. The corner of a member card poked into frame, bearing an embossed number that matched a donor wire. The photograph showed, in a single, compact instant, a handful of alignments that our files had been arranging for months, a signature repetition, a date, a serial number, a handoff. A breath moved through the room. My mother's jaw tightened. She gripped her own hands in her lap and did not look at the image. The cameras did not make a sound, but their lenses held the room like light held a thread. Alicia called the ledger keeper to the stand. He testified to the ways the numbers in the ledger correlated to bank transmissions, to the habit of recording donors in a shorthand that only a few of the office staff used, to the unusual entries that coincided with events Jean had kept in her own scrapbooks. When the court reporter asked him to slow, he did, and the weight of minutia filled the room. Dates matched to days of week, ink impressions to pen models, deposit slips that bore not only amounts but marginalia. Brian objected to the relevance. The judge allowed the testimony. Relevance, she said, is measured by the linkage of events. The linkage had been what we'd been building, a lattice, not a thunderbolt. Then Alicia called on a handwriting analyst. We had been reluctant to do this. Specialists cost time and carry their own arc of skepticism. But the analyst's testimony was precise and small in the way that matters. She compared the signature on Exhibit 24 to the samples in the ledger and testified to a pattern consistent with the same hand. The samples were not identical. Hands shift with time and fatigue. But they carried the same idiosyncratic loop in the J, the same pressure on the descending L of the surname. It was not the sort of thing a court could declare beyond all doubt. It was the sort of thing that, added to the wires, the note, the notary seal, accumulated into credible reality. Under cross-examination, Keller tried to drive a wedge. He suggested the analyst's conclusions were interpretive, that photographs could be staged, that memories were porous. He asked the ledger keeper whether anyone else had access to the records. The ledger keeper said yes, several staffers had access, but that the notation style was a consistent habit across entries that the auditor had repeatedly noted as unique. Keller tried to suggest motive, that Jean had been unsettled, that she might have misplaced things, that our chain of custody could be constructed after the fact. It was the moment any taste like ours faces. Skepticism calibrated to protect the powerful from inconvenient truths. The room braced for the collapse of the structure we had built one paper at a time. I felt the old, familiar fear for myself, for my mother, for the decency Jean had insisted upon. But I also felt an opposite thing, the calm of someone who had practiced patience as a craft. I was called to the stand. My voice did not shake when I recounted the note Jean had left for me. The exact phrasing she used for small proofs. Look at the little things. I read aloud a passage from Jean's note that had been bound into the exhibits. Not an accusation, but an instruction on how to observe life. The words landed plainly, without flourish, and in the silence that followed, it felt as though the room listened not to an argument, but to a manner of living being presented as evidence. Brian's closing in that phase was theatrical, as theater often is. Lofty questions about fairness, concern for the precedent of admitting such a collage of documents and photographs. Alicia's response was quieter. She pointed to the ledger, to the wires, to the notary stamps. She reminded the court that truth often arrived by accumulation, that institutions are not upheld by declarations alone, but by the slow diligence of those who keep records, who reconcile numbers, who mark dates on calendars, and then live up to them. Judge O'Connor peered at the exhibits with the steady appraisal she had been perfecting across a bench years long. When she spoke, she did so as if she were setting a book down after reading a chapter that had decided matters more by chapter than by climax. This court, she said, that Exhibit 24, in conjunction with the ledger entries and sworn affidavits, constitutes admissible and probative evidence. Her voice was not triumphal. It simply concluded what the documents had been assembling in silence. There was a brief procedural sequence after that, a directed accounting, an order for a neutral third party to audit the transactions, an injunction against dissipating the contested funds pending the outcome. It was, in legal terms, the beginning of remedy. For us, it felt like the thin breathing room after holding underwater for a long time, a space to cough, to remember how to speak in air again. Outside, the press coalesced. Cameras flashed like sudden summers of light, but the flash did not locate me. What I noticed first as we walked off the courthouse steps was the smallness of my hands around the binder. The weight had not left entirely. It had shifted from being a burden to being a responsibility I understood anew. My mother walked beside me, translucid with relief and the slow, complicated shame of a life under scrutiny. She reached for my hand, and I did not pull away. There would be appeals. There would be critics who said we had won on technicality, or that the court's orders would not heal the soft and private ways betrayal had shaped a family's evenings. All true. The court's ruling was a hinge, not a destination. That night, at home, I made the tea my grandmother would have approved of. Water just short of the boil, a count of 22 steady heartbeats before pouring. I sat with the photograph laid on the kitchen table between me and the small lamp, its light making a bright scallop over the image. I traced the fold in the envelope with my fingertip, feeling the smallness of paper against my skin. Jean's voice, memory, not ghost, came back to me with the same plain counsel it had always offered.